One quick example here that I think is useful to look at is Ruth Gilmore wrote a wonderful book called Golden Gulag. That's her analysis of the prison industrial complex in California and how it developed over about a 20-year period. And she has a very interesting account at the beginning of that book that I encourage you all to read in the introduction, where she says, "This is how I came to be asking these questions." And she says, "The reason I'm asking these questions is because I was involved in anti-prison organizing in LA for many, many years, and people kept asking, why is the prison industrial complex growing like this? Why are prisons being developed in all these rural communities?" And then she set out to try and answer those questions. I think there's an interesting model there of some kind of accountability in responding to movement needs and expectations. So second question, I told you I'd ask 3 questions. The second question that I think is really key is, how do we give back? And here I think about Laura Polito, who's an activist scholar, also in LA. And she's written about this as a question of reciprocation. As anarchists, I think we could also think about it as mutual aid, a research practice of mutual aid. I like to think of it that way. Now, Polito points out, and I think she's right about this, that many people in university contexts incorrectly understand their research work as a contribution. It's often not, especially when you think about the balance there, right? In terms of people who are getting tenure off of what they're doing, or people who are getting a PhD out of what they're doing, and the movements that maybe have this kind of slightly irrelevant book or article to show for it. So I actually don't think that research is a good basis for thinking about how do we give back. I mean, certain kinds of research for sure, but that answer doesn't just fly on its own. And I think we actually need to be, again, this is a difficult one, thinking about what are more truly authentic reciprocal research practices that we can be taking up, and can actually be the kind of give and take that's based on genuine relationship building between researchers and people in all sorts of movement contexts. And those kinds of relationships are things that you have to create those over years. They're not something you can just sort of drop in and do. So one example here. I have a really good friend in New York who has actually used some of her research activities to begin collaborating with a whole series of community-based organizations around political education trainings. And she's actually been able, it's not like she just comes in and does the political education training. She's actually helped with this series of organizations to help them develop their own political education trainings and run their own political education trainings. I think that's actually a much more conscious way of thinking about giving back. It's not necessarily rooted in her research. It's rooted in her relationships with these groups that are connected to her research for sure. So third question. This is the one I think is most difficult. How are we to be held accountable? So my friend Stephanie Gilliard, who's an organizer with Project South in Atlanta, Georgia, once explained to me that accountability is relationships that come with expectations and expectations that come with consequences. I think that's a really succinct way to say it, so I'll say it again. Relationships that come with expectations and expectations that come with consequences. So as I've said, I think we can see lots of expectations and consequences in how universities operate, right? In the ways that they reward and punish us based on the kinds of work we do or don't do. But we don't have many formalized mechanisms for movements to have stated expectations and then actually material consequences for researchers. And I think it's useful to think about that. I think we actually need to begin thinking about generating or soliciting articulated expectations and ways to face consequences when we don't follow through on those expectations in the research work that we're doing, when we're just taken off to pursue our careers. Now, I think in the best sorts of circumstances, these kinds of expectations and consequences are most usefully developed by collaborating with specific organizations that we can have relationships with. I think it's much harder when we think about sort of amorphous movements that we're somehow trying to relate to and solicit expectations and then sort of have them in some way hold us accountable. But I recognize that right now, with the state of the left, there aren't a ton of organizations, so this gets challenging. I'll give you one example from my own experience. I think it's imperfect. But when I was working on my PhD dissertation, I actually constructed a second committee. I had a committee that was the people who were evaluating me within the academic institution, and then I had a committee of activists that I had approached and asked to actually read everything and hold me accountable around what I was saying, how I was using the interview material, the kinds of theoretical points I was making, the implications for movement. I think that's really not enough, but I think we could at least begin to think about some of those alternative structures of accountability that are direct, where those people would call me out, you know? Okay, so I should wrap this up. I think that basically these are the sorts of questions that we need to be facing and practically resolving if we're going to be cultivating accountability between researchers and movements. I think there's a ton more questions to get into. I think we've really only scratched the surface, and I'm hoping we're actually going to be able to get further into some of this. Ultimately, I'm convinced, though, that facilitating, developing accountability between researchers and movements can actually enliven and inspire the possibilities for researchers to more genuinely contribute in their own specific ways to advancing social transformation. That's why I'm down for this. And I'm excited about the conversations we're going to have. Thanks.